Now, one thing that I think is very important that has been said by Obama and others in the Obama administration, even though it may not be said yet by members of Congress, is that what's going on in the Israel-Palestine conflict does not represent solely an adjunct of the so-called global war on terror. They are not talking about Hamas as equal to Al-Qaeda. That's important, because for George Bush, his pro-Israeli extremism was all bound up in this so-called global war on terror. That has changed. That has changed, and we need to take advantage of that change. So we need to look at what we can do given this shift in the political discourse. Now, one of the things that Will Heumann said that I think is so important is that this notion that the people who are making policy don't know very much. So one of the things that's hard about lobbying or about doing advocacy, because we don't only lobby. Some of us are from organizations that aren't allowed to lobby, but we educate and we advocate for positions that aren't necessarily tied to a specific piece of legislation. But it's all a little bit intimidating. It's a little intimidating to go into a congressional office and, this is the special assistant for blah, blah, And, you look at them and say, aren't you a little young? And I don't want to be ageist here, but looking around this room, that's going to be a factor. Well, it's not only about age, it's about knowledge. The fact that you just listened to Chris Tenzing for 15 minutes means you know more than anybody in that office that you're going to be meeting with. So take that as as a strength. Take that as something you're bringing to them. You're bringing that information. They should be grateful, these people. Now, they won't necessarily see it that way, but this is a new moment. When the usual thing of you come and you put either money or votes on the table. And most of the time, we don't bring either money or a lot of votes. But we bring information and we bring morality. And this new moment in Washington, my God, we've got an intellectual in the White House. What about that? This is huge, and we have to take advantage of that information matters, maybe in a way that it hasn't in 8 or even 16 years, right? So we have to take advantage of that and see it that way. We need to talk about the frame that we heard on the inauguration. So when we talk about Martin Luther King, it's not just about I Have a Dream, it's also about the Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church of 1967. Read that speech tonight when you go home, before you go on the Hill tomorrow. Google it and read it. Because I'll tell you something, that speech where Martin Luther King linked militarism and greed and racism as the 3 evils of this country that have to be combated simultaneously, that's the model for us. And that's the model that Barack Obama is claiming as his own. Unlike other high-ranking African-American or other people of color who have come up to high ranks in the U.S. government, he's the first who didn't say, those people have nothing to do with me. I did this because my parents were exceptional. My parents raised me to be exceptional. He says, I stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before. He claims those movements, the movements that we are part of. So that's a big part of what we, I think, need to do. Now, I'll say in a moment of shameless promotion, pick up a copy of my book if you can, Understanding the Palestinian Israeli Conflict. Not because I think those of you in this room need it, but because it's organized in exactly the way most congressional staffers think, which is short and done as frequently asked questions. So you can say to them, you don't have to read this book, but just go to that one question that gives you, 3 paragraphs on who is Hamas, because chances are they really don't have a clue. Trust me on this. So, bring them resources. Your goal here is to become, over time, the best friend of those staffers that you're dealing with. You're going to provide them with the information they don't even know that they need. You're bringing them information that the Jewish anti-occupation organizations now speak for far more Jews in this country than do the organizations like AIPAC and the Council of Presidents. Now I want to talk, I just have a couple more minutes, and I want to talk just for a moment about Gaza. and about the specifics of Gaza. I'm not going to get into the humanitarian impact. You all know that. You know how the slaughter of Gaza has been as dramatic as it has. What I think is important here to recognize, when somebody comes back to you and says, but it's self-defense, the answer is twofold. One that's always been our answer, and one that's partly new. What's always been our answer is, how you judge an action depends on when you start the clock. That's the first thing. So if you start the clock at the moment that some rocket goes from Gaza into Israel, you're going to say that anything that happens after that is in response, that it's self-defense. But if you go back 1 minute before that rocket was fired, you can look at what happened on November 4th, when Israel violated the ceasefire. But more important, go back to the middle of June when the ceasefire began. And what you'll see is the ceasefire worked. No rockets killed anybody, and none of them did any significant damage for almost 6 months. And it was violated by Israel. Why was it an issue even then? Because the civilians of Gaza were still facing an act of war. That act of war was not just military strikes, but the blockade. In international law, a blockade can be an act of war. So when you deny people access to food, medicine, sufficient clean water, fuel for the hospitals, that's an act of war. And when you look at the Israeli claims, go to the website and tell the people you're talking to that they should go to the website of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and look at January 4th. And they'll see a statement from the Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Tzipi Livni, who of course is running for Prime Minister, where she said, our diplomacy, our new diplomacy of these last few days was aimed at alleviating the pressure for a ceasefire. It wasn't aimed at stopping the killing. It was aimed at alleviating the pressure for a ceasefire. Those are her words, not my words. Refer them to that. Refer them to December 31st, the main newspaper of Israel, the daily newspaper Haaretz, and I refer all of you to the Haaretz website. It's one of the best sources around, and it's useful to be able to cite an Israeli source. Front page article on New Year's Eve in Haaretz documented day by day how the planning for this attack did not begin when, quote, the ceasefire crumbled. It did not begin because we had to respond to rocket fire. Among other things, you can see on their website, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, how the number of rockets diminished to less than 2 a month during the ceasefire that worked. But you'll see at the Haaretz website how the planning for this attack began in early June while Israel was negotiating the ceasefire. They knew from the beginning the ceasefire was not real. They had no intention of maintaining it. They wanted it because they wanted extra time to build up their weapons. What were those weapons? They were U.S. weapons. And that's my final point. This is all about the U.S. People can think what they want about Israel. We are concerned with the United States policy. That's why I urge you, if you're not already members, if your organization is not already a member of the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation, join it. Because what binds us all together, because people work on all kinds of different issues, is we focus on U.S. policy. So when a Palestinian in Gaza, when there's a brief moment in the shelling when it stops, and they look outside, what do they see? They see U.S.-made, U.S.-produced, U.S.-paid-for F-16s. They see U.S.-made, U.S.-paid-for, U.S.-produced Apache helicopters, dropping U.S.-made, U.S.-produced TOW missiles, driven by fuel provided by the U.S. This is our responsibility, and